Hello and welcome to another Dungeons & Dragons session dramatization set in the world of Alter Aeon. Our protagonists are Kara the Warmage, Morden the Hexblade, Tess the Sorceress, and Cined the Favored Soul. I am Shadowfax, the Dungeon Master. Before we start, here's a little more info about our heroes. Kara is a 16-year-old human girl. She has a fair complexion, red hair, and blue eyes. She weighs just over 100 pounds. She wears plain studded leather armor. Kara does have some patches and paraphernalia from when she worked as a mercenary, but she chooses not to carry it openly. Morden is a young human male with amber eyes and a pale complexion. I'd imagine as a burgeoning hexblade, he favors black clothing. Although Morden is only in his early 20s, his face bears the scars of many previous battles. Tess is a freckle-faced half-elven maiden with red hair and green eyes. She is 22 years old, and because of her mixed heritage, that puts her at roughly the same age as Kara mentally. When performing, Tess wears a black leotard with coattails and a top hat. But while adventuring, she wears more practical clothing. Fernando the Ferret, familiar, sits on one of Tess's shoulders most of the time. Our story picks up immediately after where the last session left off. Kara, Morden, and Tess sold off the weapons they had collected from the bandits they had defeated in the swamp, had breakfast, and returned to the Mercenary Guild to talk to Gilbert, the Guildmaster, about their next job. Gilbert noted that it was good that the three of them had chosen to work together, because the contract specifically called for 3 bodies. The job was to escort a man from Stillwater to Venetia, help him find an artifact, and return him back to Stillwater safely. The man's name was Cined, and they would find him at Fort Maracaibo. Morden asked what the client was looking for, but Gilbert could only say that the client was tight-lipped about the subject, only mentioning that he thought that the artifact might be accessible due to the recent upheaval in the city. Gilbert also hinted that it would be underground. Our heroes accepted the contract and decided to do some shopping in town to prepare for the mission. They first went to the apothecary, but quickly discovered that the potions were way out of their price range. They then visited the general store and bought rope, lanterns, torches, and a shovel. It was mid-morning after running around town, so they decided to set out. They left town via the north gate, heading up the dirt road toward their destination. It was a sunny day, and the weather was pleasant. After about an hour, they passed the zombie that they had beaten 2 days prior. They encountered the fork in the road in the early afternoon, although this time they chose the road to Stillwater instead of heading into the swamp. Ultimately, our heroes were alert as they traveled, but their journey was uneventful. While traveling, Kara told her companions that she had been to Venetia before, as it was the site of her one and only battle while with her previous employer, the Red Ravens. It had been about 3 months ago. The battle was short, with many spellcasters like Kara setting loose their spells from a distance to level the city. The inhabitants of Venetia had no defense against their magic, and they surrendered after the first barrage. Tess inquired of the current political situation of Slowey, as she knew little about its history. Morden relayed the history of the island, starting with the discovery of the island of Arceus by Gad Adelbrook centuries ago. Morden explained that many years later, after the portal system linking Arceus, Cordan, and Slowey together was activated, people from Atmir began to explore the other 2 islands. After establishing the base camp that would later become Vimarken, they of course came into contact with the Zulians. Morden noted that the Zulians' frequent internecine warfare had weakened them, and they were ripe for invasion by Atmiri warlords. Since then, most other Zulian towns and cities had already been conquered by or ceded to colonists. Venetia had been the last city to resist. Come sunset, the trio could see Fort Maracaibo, which guarded the southern and eastern roads leading in and out of Stillwater. The fort was little more than a box-shaped tall stone wall with a portcullis. It flew the flag of the Red Ravens, and guards outside wore patches with a similar design. Our heroes approached and asked if anyone by the name of Cined had entered the fort, and after talking amongst themselves for a moment, one of the guards said that he thought that Cined had been in the tavern all day. Our heroes entered and saw that all of the buildings therein were crowded around its center, away from the walls. Having been stationed at the fort for months, Kara was able to lead them straight to the tavern. Their description of Cined from Gilbert was that he was a young Zulian man with a medium tan complexion, short black hair, and gray eyes. Several of the patrons at the bar matched the description of Cined, so Morden called out his name to get his attention. Or at least he called out a facsimile of his name that sounded more like Cined. A man wearing chain armor over top a yellow robe immediately shot up and bounded to Morden, demanding to know who dared to say his name in such a fashion. Morden calmly explained that he was sent by the guild and apologized for mispronouncing his name. After demanding the names of Kara and Tess, Cined accepted Morden's apology and asked them if they were ready to leave right away or if they wanted to go tomorrow morning. The group decided to leave for Venetia the following morning, and Cined paid for their dinners and put them up in the inn, renting one room for the ladies and another for him and Morden. When Morden woke up in the morning, he saw that Cined was already awake and appeared to be meditating. Kara knocked on the door just as Morden was opening it, and with Tess they went over to the tavern to have breakfast. Cined joined them about 15 minutes later and paid for their meals. The men helped each other put their armor on, and the four of them left the fort, heading on the eastern road. Venetia, or Venetia, as Cined called it, was about a half-day's journey from Stillwater. The road led through a lightly forested area, and then followed the beach on the northern shore of Slowey. It looked like some crops had been planted, but the grain was yellowed and sickly. Kara hopped in the ocean to get a close look at a dead body that some seagulls were picking at, but otherwise their trip was without incident. It was late afternoon when the road brought them to the outskirts of Venetia, or at least what was left of it. The city had been built partially in the water, where canals served as the means of travel. The rest of the city that was on land had a conventional street system, but the wooden buildings had been burnt down. The buildings in the water had been built of stone, but they looked melted in places, like they had been blasted with lava. Kara tried to remember the layout of the city, but couldn't, as she had only been there briefly, and it didn't look anything like before. The city was surrounded by a moat, and the bridge that the road once had led to had been destroyed. Morden wanted to see how deep the moat was, so he tossed in a rock, but the moat water was muddy, and it soon vanished from sight. He then grabbed a long branch and stuck it in the moat to see how deep it was. No matter how far he thrust it into the water, he couldn't feel the bottom. Heading southeast, they followed the moat inland, but every place that looked like where there had been once a bridge no longer had one. The terrain was forested, but many of the trees had been knocked down as if a windstorm had recently swept through. Just before the sun had set, Cined, who had been bringing up the rear, tapped Tess, who was ahead of him, on the shoulder and whispered for her to stop. In similar fashion, Tess tapped Kara's shoulder, who then tapped Morden's shoulder, and with all of them stopped, Cined strode up beside the others and quietly said, "There are two men watching us from the bushes." He discreetly pointed with his lips to the south. Tess cast Ghost Sound, and the spell produced a noise like a woman's scream in the direction Cined had indicated. The wailing was enough to spook the mysterious observers, who leapt from the bushes and ran into the nearby forest as quick as they could. Tess asked if they should follow them, and Cined replied, "No, let them go. We must hurry." Deciding that it was fruitless to continue looking for a bridge, Cined suggested that they try to jump the moat, saying that with Morden's strength he might be able to even throw Cined and the girls across. Morden didn't think that was a good idea, because if he failed, then they would be separated. Instead, he searched the forest for a log that looked long enough and wide enough to serve as an impromptu bridge. After finding and placing the log, each of the group carefully crossed the moat. Once all of them had made it, Cined pushed the log into the moat, stating that he didn't want anyone following them. They lit their lanterns and headed down the city street. Cined said that they were looking for a way underground. After searching a couple of streets, Fernando indicated to his mistress that he could hear something underground nearby. Morden heard it too, and everyone stopped and stood silently. They could all hear the irregular tapping sound, like a gentle thumping, under the street. Kara took her shovel, handed her lantern to Tess, and started digging. No sooner had Kara turned over the loose stones on top, Tess saw a figure moving toward them down a side alley. After focusing the lantern on it, they could see it was a skeleton. Tess let fly a magic missile, which struck the undead creature, but it kept coming. Morden rushed up to the skeleton and slashed at it with his scimitar, but all it cut was air as it passed through a gap in the skeleton's rib cage. From over Morden's shoulder, Kara cast Disrupt Undead, and the yellowish-green ray of energy blasted the skeleton to pieces. Morden crushed the skull with his boot, and they returned to the task at hand, with Kara digging and the others keeping watch. Under the stone, Kara started to remove dirt, and the thumping sound grew louder. Now this time, it was Morden who spotted something approaching in the dark. The lantern light revealed it to be another skeleton, rounding the corner of a burnt-down house. Our heroes pounced on the undead monster, with Tess first casting dancing lights to keep the battleground lit. Morden's scimitar caught hold of the creature better than the last one, and he split the skeleton up the center. Cined entered the fray, swinging at the skeleton with his mace, but missing entirely. Kara finished it off with a blow from her Morning Star, and Morden crushed its skull with his boot like the first one. It was now about midnight. Morden took up the task of digging, as Kara was getting tired. After digging down about 10 feet, he broke through the top of a pre-existing hole. The others handed down a lantern to him, and Morden could see what looked like fog in the hole below him. However, before he could investigate further, another fight ensued. With her keen, elvish sight, Tess's eye once again caught another creature, moving toward them in the darkness. Focusing the lantern light on it, they saw what looked like a moving tree stump with a crown of nettles on top. Tess correctly identified it as a thorn beast, also known as a briar vex. The thorny beast was headed toward them, but its gait was ponderously slow. As each time it moved a base tendril forward, it had to reroot itself briefly to stay upright. Tess quickly relayed the information to her companions. Morden scrambled to climb out of the hole and dashed toward the monster with scimitar in hand, with Kara running beside him so she could get in range of her orb spells. Tess didn't want to wait for it to get close enough to use its thorns against them, and she let loose a magic missile that tore a trench across the creature's bark-like surface. Cined rushed toward the thorn beast, but he was slower than Kara and Morden. Once Morden reached the foe, he carved a great chunk off of the beast. The beast angrily lashed out at Morden with its thorny vines, but they failed to penetrate his armor. Kara angled herself so as not to catch Morden in the blast, and hurled a lesser orb of fire at the thorn beast. Upon contact, the beast was burnt to a crisp. Our heroes returned to the hole and discovered that it wasn't fog within it, it was smoke. It had a distinct burnt smell, and they could feel warmth coming from the hole. During the fight with the thorn beast, however, most of the smoke had escaped, and there was only a little left. Peering down the hole with their lantern, they could see that they had reached the top of a ceramic pipe. It was about 3 feet in diameter, wide enough so they could crawl through it on their hands and knees if they so chose. The tapping sound they had heard before was now clearly that of dripping water. Cined turned to Tess and said, "Perhaps this is a job for the animal." Tess agreed, and obligingly, Fernando climbed down the pipe. The dripping water was blocking his way south, so he headed north. Morden tied a rope to his beacon lantern and lowered it down behind Fernando so that he could see a fair distance in front of him. The ferret kept going forward until he reached a junction where the pipe stopped and he could go either right or left. He chose to follow the pipe that felt warmer. Fernando pressed forward, now without the lantern light, walking in total darkness, using his sense of smell to guide him. After about 4 hours, Tess could feel that Fernando had reached a place where he felt less cramped, as he had entered a larger pipe that he felt that his mistress could probably comfortably stand in. However, Fernando had only gone a few feet into the larger pipe before he felt threatened, and he started scrambling for the surface in fear. And that is where our session ended. Please like the video and subscribe to our channel to continue following the story of our heroes. Transcripts of our Dungeons & Dragons sessions are available at www.lawful-evil.org/DND. If you enjoyed this and don't already play the game this is based on, you can explore the world of Alter Aeon for yourself by visiting www.alteraeon.com. Remember, the family that plays together stays together. Thanks for listening, and happy mudding, everybody.
Alteraeon.com. That's ALTERAEON.com.